My name is Mike Kurth, and this is your first video lecture in Economics 201. And what I'd like to talk with you about today is what economics is all about. I'm going to hold up a definition of economics, and this says that economics is the study of how people make choices when confronted with scarcity and how they work and cooperate to overcome the problem of scarcity. Now, scarcity is the key economic problem. And it's important for you to understand exactly what we mean by that term, scarcity. The economic definition of scarcity is that a good is scarce if there's not enough of it to go around freely to satisfy everybody who wants it. Now, we use the term scarcity in general language all the time. For example, we say Lamborghinis are relatively rare. They're scarce. We don't see a lot of them. But Chevrolets are abundant. We see them all the time. But in economics, if Chevrolets were free, would there be enough Chevrolets to satisfy everybody in the world who wants one? Everybody could have a Chevrolet for free? No, clearly not. So even though they're relatively common, even though they're relatively abundant to an economist, they're still scarce. They're scarce because not everybody can have one. So when a good is scarce, it means that we have to compete to get it. We have to decide who's going to get it and who's going to be left out because they're not enough for everybody to have all that they want. Now, think about it. What good is not scarce? Just about everything in the world is scarce. Even mundane things like pencils or ballpoint pens, if they were free, not everybody in the world could have all the pencils or pens or eggs or whatever that they wanted. There wouldn't be enough to go around. Often students will suggest to me, well, what about water? There's enough water for everybody. Well, that depends on where you are. In Louisiana, we have enough water. But if you're in the desert in Arizona or Saudi Arabia or someplace, there's not enough water. And there's different kinds of water. We have a lot of dirty swamp water in Louisiana, but clean water, that's a different matter. There's not enough clean water that we can just waste it and everybody can have it if it were available for free. Another example would be air. Well, we have clean air and we have dirty air. There's a lot of dirty air, but clean air, we have to, there's a cost to it. We can't have as much clean air as we want. But in general, just generic air. We don't really worry much about that because it is not scarce. Like if you're thinking, if you're going to enter a classroom, you don't look in that classroom and think, ooh, is there enough air in there for me to breathe? Or if you're sitting next to other students, you don't look at them and go, ooh, they're breathing awfully hard, they're using up my air. We don't really think about air on a moment-to-moment basis because it's not scarce. But if it were scarce, how would this change our behavior? So for example, imagine you're in the bank making a deposit, 5 o'clock in the evening, and 3 bank robbers run in, and they round all the customers and the cashiers up, and they lock you in a vault. And there's 12 of you. They lock 12 people in the vault. And it's a vault that doesn't open up until 8 o'clock the next morning. So it's going to be 15 hours before it opens up. And there's a sign on the wall that says there's only enough air in that vault for 6 people to survive for 15 hours. So now air is scarce. There's only enough for 6 people, and you've got 12 people in there. So what's going to happen? What are you going to do? Are you all just going to sit there and die? By 1 o'clock in the morning, you'll be dead. You run out of air. Or is there going to be a fight to see who survives? Are some of the people going to gang up on the others and try to kill them so that they can have their air? If you fight over it, you use a lot of energy in the fight. You use up air in that, so it may not get you very far. Um, but when they open up the vault in the morning, are they going to find 12 dead bodies? Or are they going to find 6 dead bodies and 6 live bodies? This is a social dilemma. I mean, it would be possible for 6 people to survive if you could eliminate the other 6. And a better social outcome than having 12 dead bodies would be to have 6 survivors from a social standpoint. But how are you going to determine who gets the air and who doesn't? Well, other than fighting over it and using up a lot of air in the process, one thing you might do is draw straws. Say, okay, the ones with the long straws live, the ones with the short straws die. Well, that's a random process. It's a method of random selection. Is that the best way to allocate the air? Well, if half the people have to die, maybe, for me, I'd say let the older ones survive. The younger ones, we don't need them, okay? But most of you would probably disagree with me and say, hey, the older ones, they've already lived their lives, they're useless. Let's save the young ones. The young ones still have their lives to live. Or some people may say, let's save the women, because women are the child bearers. You see this in some societies where they're under great duress, that women have been protected because they're the child bearers. If you have 6 women and 1 man, you can have 6 babies in 9 months later. But if you have 1 woman and 6 men, you can only have 1 baby. So we have to make these decisions as to who are the most valuable ones to save, who should survive. So, you sit down and you say, well, how should we allocate this air? And there was actually a true incident about 10 years ago. Involved a mine collapse up in Pennsylvania, and they were desperately digging to try to get down to save the miners. They were trapped deep underground, and they knew the miners only had a certain amount of air. And it took them about a week to get down there. And when they got down there was 1 survivor. And that survivor had all the air bottles from all the other miners. See, all the miners have, when they're in the mine, they have an air bottle with about 24 hours worth of air. And there were 12 of them. And what happened was the miners all got together and said, we don't have enough air for everyone to survive. The person they gave it to was the youngest miner, who was married and had just had a baby. And so they chose to give all their air to that person. Now, if you were in that situation, would you make that decision? Would you give up your air and volunteer to die so that certain people could live? That's the kind of situations that we sometimes find ourselves in with scarcity. And from a social standpoint, it's not always a matter of life and death. Sometimes it is. But what we want to try to do as a society is to avoid the violence. Scarcity is going to cause people to compete for these scarce resources. And sometimes that competition can be destructive. It can be wasteful and it can be destructive. In the bank vault, if everybody's fighting each other to try to see who survived, you could use up all the air just fighting. So what most societies do is they establish certain rules, or what I call social conventions. And social conventions are not really the same as laws, but they're customs or the traditions that people have for allocating scarce resources. Something like on the Titanic, who gets the lifeboats? Women and children first. Who said? Is that a law? No, it's not a law. It was a social convention. So the men, even some of the richest men in the world, stayed on the boat while the women and children got in the lifeboat, because that was a social convention. That was the way we allocated it. And we have a lot of social conventions in our society, that we just, certain things that we understand. Like if there's not enough chairs for everybody, men are supposed to stand up and give their chairs to women. Young people stand up and give their chairs to an old man like me. That's a social convention as to how we allocate these resources. If we don't have a common set of social conventions, very often we have to turn to laws, rules, regulations to govern how we allocate these scarce resources. You think about driving on the highway. There's a limited amount of highway space. So who's going to get that? Well, we say, you have to drive on the right side of the road instead of the left side. In England, they drive on the left side instead of the right side. But we have this rule that you don't have just all the road to yourself. You can have the right side of the road. And we may not need laws to enforce that very much, as long as everybody knows that's the side that you drive on. But if everybody doesn't know that, then you need to have laws. You need to establish laws and regulations to govern that. Now, there's a lot of different ways to allocate scarce resources. One way, one custom in the West is to stand in line. First come, first serve. If there's not, we're waiting to get tickets at the box office, or you're waiting for something, we tend to line up, form queues. If you go to some other parts of the world, down in Mexico, they don't know what a line is. They just all kind of gather around and push and shove, and they don't line up the way that we do. We could do things by drawing straws, rolling the dice to see who gets it. There's a lot of different ways. We could give it, everybody gets an equal amount. That's the common way. There's not enough to go around, so we have the cake, so we'll cut up little slices, and everybody gets exactly the same amount of cake. There are a lot of different mechanisms, and we tend to judge these mechanisms. They all produce different outcomes. And so we look at these mechanisms and we judge them by 3 criteria. One is efficiency. Is it the best use for those resources? Another one is it equitable and fair? And a third one is it moral? Take a family, for example, and they got kids. I've got 6 kids, so I know what it is to try to allocate resources across these kids. And most parents will start out, Christmas time, how do you allocate the Christmas budget? Each kid gets the same amount of money spent on them for Christmas, equal per head. He said, that's fair. Okay. But if you have a child with a special need, then you may say, well, this Christmas, this child's going to get more. They're going to get, because they have a greater need. So sometimes we will override that everybody gets an equal amount and do it on the basis of need and fairness, instead of everybody gets the same amount. Sometimes efficiency is the major criteria. If you imagine, say, traveling in a wagon train across the American frontier, you're attacked by Indians, you got a certain amount of bullets, are you going to give everybody an equal amount of bullets, or are you going to allocate the bullets to those who are the best shot? It wouldn't be very efficient to give everybody the same amount of bullets. If Annie Oakley is on that wagon train, you'd want to give Annie Oakley as many bullets as she could use, That would be the most efficient. So among the allocation mechanisms, price to the highest bidder, that's one method of allocating, auctioning it off. And one of the things about price is that it will give the the good or the resource to those who value it the most, those who have the greatest value for it. We use markets to allocate scarce resources. Markets establish prices, and markets are generally considered to be efficient because they will transfer resources to their highest and best use. But are markets fair? There are a lot of things that we look at the market allocating the resources and we say, well, that's efficient, but we don't think that's fair, or we don't think that's moral. We're talking about healthcare right now. That's a big debate, and if we allow the market to allocate healthcare, then there's a concern that only certain people will be able to afford healthcare. And you say, well, that's not fair. That's not just. Okay. So we want the government to step in and take over healthcare and produce a fair outcome. We want everybody to have access to healthcare, to good healthcare. That the market is not necessarily going to produce that outcome. So there's a lot of areas where we look at the market and we say, oh, that's efficient, but that's not fair. That's not equitable. There's other cases where we look at goods and we say, boy, the market is very efficient at doing that, but we don't think that shouldn't be allowed. That's not moral. I mean, sex gets bought and sold in markets, and prostitution. But we don't think that's moral. It's not that it's not efficient. We don't think it's moral. It's not right. We have drugs, recreational drugs that people use, and they get sold in markets. They get sold on the streets all the time. But we make that illegal because we don't think that's moral. Selling body parts. In some parts of the world, you're allowed to sell body parts. The American Medical Association has done several studies and recommended that we establish markets for things like kidneys, where you have 2 kidneys and you can sell one, or things like even eyes or corneas. You can donate them, but you can't sell them. One of the things that markets do is the price in the market, and this is unique about using markets to allocate resources, is the price creates an incentive to produce. So if you were to say, oh, we think everybody in America should be entitled to 2 hamburgers a month. That's American. Well, good, 2 free hamburgers, but who's going to make those hamburgers? Who's going to show up at McDonald's or Burger King and start flipping burgers if they're not paid for it? And so the price provides an incentive to produce. If you say hamburgers are free, nobody's going to produce hamburgers. All you're going to have is pizza and chicken. Because why should anybody make a hamburger who's going to want to volunteer their time to make a hamburger? So this is a very important aspect of price. Besides price being efficient and allocating resources to their highest use, price provides an incentive to produce that drawing straws or standing in line doesn't produce. They provide no incentive for production. But we have to decide as a society, how are we going to allocate these scarce resources? And one of the things we want to do is minimize violence and destructive behavior in the competition for scarce resources. The other criteria, efficiency, fairness, justice, morality, that depends on the social customs, that depends on your religion, it depends on your upbringing, it depends on a lot of other things as to what you think about that. Now there's a video that I would like you to watch on the internet. It's called Illegal Everything by John Stossel. I'll provide you with a link to that. But it addresses that issue of what should be illegal and what should be allowed to be sold in the market. Thank you very much.